I had been on the road for weeks, traveling through different national parks, camping wherever I could find solitude. It was late fall, and most places were nearly empty, just how I liked it. One night I set up camp deep in the woods of Yellowstone, far from any main trails, near a secluded creek. No cell service, no crowds, just the crackling of my fire and the distant sounds of the forest. It was perfect. I spent the evening the way I always did, cooking a simple meal, reading by the fire, and soaking in the peace of being alone. But as the fire burned lower, I started to get that strange, creeping feeling, the kind you get when you're being watched. I shook it off. It was probably just my imagination. Then my phone buzzed. No service. How was I getting a message? The number was unknown. The text simply said, "Nice spot. I see why you picked it." I felt a cold wave wash over me. I turned my headlamp on, scanning the darkness beyond my camp. Nothing. The trees stood still, silent. Another message. "Enjoying the fire?" I stood up, heart pounding. I wasn't sure what to do. It had to be a prank, right? But how would anyone know where I was? I typed back, "Who is this?" No response. The fire crackled beside me, but the night suddenly felt too quiet. I reached for my backpack, pulling out my hunting knife. I wasn't the kind of person to carry a gun, but right now I wished I had one. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, crunching the fallen leaves behind me. I spun around, headlamp cutting through the darkness, but I saw nothing. Just trees, shadows, and the faint outline of my truck parked about 50 yards away. Another text. "You always leave your truck unlocked?" I swallowed hard. Someone was here. Someone had been watching me long enough to know I hadn't locked the doors. I grabbed my keys and hit the lock button. The distant beep echoed through the trees. Then another sound. Not footsteps this time. Breathing. Just beyond the glow of my fire. Slow. Ragged. I turned my light toward the noise, but all I saw were trees. Yet I knew someone was out there. My hands were shaking as I texted back, "What do you want?" 3 dots appeared. They were typing. Then the response, "To see how brave you really are." I didn't wait. I grabbed my bag, my knife still clutched tight, and started toward my truck. Every step I took, I felt eyes on me, the heavy silence pressing in. I swung my light wildly in every direction, but I still couldn't see anything. Halfway to my truck, a noise behind me, fast, running footsteps. I sprinted, heart pounding, crashing through the underbrush. The footsteps kept pace, closing in. I threw myself into my truck, slammed the door, locked it. My breathing was ragged. Hands trembling, I reached for the ignition. Another text came in. Too slow. The fear was like ice in my veins. I started the truck, headlights flashing on. And there, at the edge of the trees, just outside the reach of the beams, movement, a figure. Tall, still, watching. I didn't stick around. I threw the truck into reverse, tires spinning in the dirt, and sped out of there so fast I barely remembered the drive back to civilization. It wasn't until the next day, when I finally had service again, that I checked my phone one last time. One final message had come through before I left. A photo. It was me, sitting by the fire, knife in hand. I had never heard them, never seen them. They had been that close the entire time. I never camp alone anymore. Every summer, my family had a tradition. We'd spend a weekend at my uncle's remote cabin deep in the forests of northern Minnesota. The place was massive, 6 bedrooms, an old stone fireplace, and surrounded by miles of dense, untouched wilderness. It had no Wi-Fi, barely any cell service, and at night it was pitch black. One summer, my cousin Ben and I convinced our parents to let us camp outside. There was a clearing about a 10-minute walk from the cabin where deer often bedded down for the night. It seemed like the perfect spot. Our parents were hesitant, but my uncle, an experienced hunter, assured them we'd be fine. That evening, we set up camp, a simple two-person tent, a small fire, and our sleeping bags. We spent hours talking, telling stories, and laughing until something cut through the night. A scream, distant but sharp, like someone calling for help. Ben and I fell silent. We glanced at each other, both uneasy. "Probably a fox," I muttered. I'd heard that foxes could sound disturbingly human, but something about it felt off. We tried to brush it off and went back to talking. Then, 20 minutes later, it happened again. Closer this time. A long, drawn-out wail that echoed through the trees. Ben grabbed the flashlight and shined it toward the woods. Nothing. Just the flickering glow of our fire against the trees. Then our phones vibrated. Both of them, at the exact same time. There was no service out here, but when we looked at our screens, we saw the same message from an unknown number. "Help me. I'm lost." Ben and I stared at each other, our skin crawling. "Who is this?" Ben typed back. Almost immediately, another message. "I see your fire." I turned off the flashlight. Our fire was small, but it was enough to be visible for a good distance. I felt exposed, like something was watching us from the trees. Then came the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, crunching the dried leaves beyond the fire's glow. Ben grabbed the hatchet we'd brought. I reached for the hunting knife in my bag. Another message. "Come help me." I turned my phone off. My heart was hammering. Ben whispered, "We need to go. Now." Before I could answer, the footsteps stopped right at the edge of the clearing, and then in the darkness, we saw it. A figure, tall, unmoving, just standing there, barely visible beyond the firelight. No flashlight, no phone screen glowing, just a silhouette, watching. Then, with a speed that made my stomach drop, it moved. Not toward us, but around us, circling just beyond the fire's edge. I wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at me to go, but my body was frozen. Ben did the only thing he could think of. He grabbed a burning log from the fire and threw it toward the figure. The second it hit the ground, there was movement, a blur of motion as the figure darted into the woods, vanishing into the darkness. We didn't wait. We grabbed our bags and bolted back toward the cabin, sprinting through the trees, our lungs burning. As we reached the porch, my uncle was already outside, rifle in hand. "Something's out there," I gasped. He didn't ask questions. He just switched on the massive floodlights around the cabin, bathing the tree line in harsh white light. Nothing. Just the trees swaying in the wind. But then, our phones vibrated again. One last message. "You run fast." We slept inside that night. In the morning, my uncle found something near our burned-out fire. Footprints, but not boot prints, not sneakers, bare feet, pressed deep into the dirt, circling the clearing, watching. We never camped in those woods again. My dad and I had always bonded over camping. Every summer, we'd take a trip to some remote place, just the two of us, disconnecting from the world. But our last trip, it changed everything. We haven't gone back since. It was a national forest deep in Montana, miles away from the nearest town. The kind of place where the stars burn bright and the silence stretches for miles. We arrived early, set up our tent near a small creek, and spent the day hiking. It was peaceful until the sun went down. That first night, we sat by the fire, listening to the distant hoots of owls and the occasional rustle in the trees. Nothing unusual. But then, at around midnight, a sound cut through the silence. A whistle. Not a bird, not the wind. A slow, deliberate human whistle. We both froze. My dad turned his head toward the darkness, his face barely lit by the fire. "Did you hear that?" I nodded, my stomach twisting. Then another whistle. Closer this time. My dad stood up, grabbed the flashlight, and pointed it toward the trees. The beam cut through the blackness, but there was nothing there. No movement, no sound, just trees swaying gently in the wind. We told ourselves it had to be another camper messing around, maybe some late-night hikers. But the uneasy feeling didn't leave us. We turned in for the night, but I couldn't sleep. The tent felt thin, flimsy. Every little sound outside made my heart jump. I must have drifted off at some point because the next thing I remember was my dad shaking me awake. "Get up," he whispered. I sat up, groggy. The fire outside had died to embers, casting a faint orange glow through the thin fabric of the tent. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow. Heavy. Circling our tent. My dad held a knife in his hand, his breathing slow and controlled. We stayed completely still, listening. The footsteps would stop, then start again on the other side of the tent, like whoever was out there was watching, waiting. Then came the worst part. The zipper of our tent, just inches from where I sat, began to move. It wasn't fast, it wasn't some animal tugging at it. It was slow, purposeful, like someone was testing it. My dad lunged forward and yanked the zipper back up, slamming his hand against the fabric. "Hey!" he shouted. Silence. Then rapid footsteps. Not walking, running. The sound of something sprinting into the trees, twigs snapping, leaves crunching. We sat there, frozen, adrenaline coursing through our veins. My dad grabbed the flashlight, unzipped the tent, and stepped outside. Nothing. Just the empty forest, stretching endlessly in all directions. That night, we didn't sleep. We sat by the fire, weapons in hand, waiting. But the footsteps never came back. By sunrise, we packed up. Neither of us spoke until we were back in the car, pulling onto the empty highway. Then my dad finally said, "That wasn't an animal." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. We both knew the truth. We weren't alone that night, and whatever was out there, it wanted in.